Hello students, welcome to the English YouTuber. In today's video, we're going to look at the line-by-line explanation of the short story Footprints Without Feet, which is written by H.G Wells. So before we go into the line-by-line explanation, let's look at the summary of the story. Griffin was a scientist who, after conducting umpteen number of experiments, so umpteen means many, so who conducted umpteen number of experiments and finally manages to turn himself invisible. He misuses his great discovery by setting his landlord's house on fire as revenge. He steals money from an inn. When he ran out of money, he also steals clothes and food for his sustenance. Even the police constable who was appointed to arrest him couldn't, as he was invisible. Thus, his power of invisibility became a threat to the society rather than a boon. So the meaning of the word boon means vardhan. So this is the summary of the story. Now let's go into the line by line explanation. So before we start, I would like to tell you that my videos will only be in English because your examination is in English. So the more you listen to English, the more you will be familiar and it will be easier for you to attempt the examination. So let's begin. The two boys startled in surprise at the fresh, muddy imprints of a pair of bare feet. So, there were two boys who were alarmed or who were frightened at a fresh, muddy imprints of a bare feet. Bare feet is when you don't wear shoes, it is called bare feet. What was a barefooted man doing on the steps of a house in the middle of London? So they were wondering, why is a person not wearing shoes in the middle of London? And where was the man? So they couldn't perceive where the man was. As they gazed, a remarkable sight met their eyes. So as they were looking, they saw something remarkable. What did they see? A fresh footmark appeared from nowhere. So they saw a fresh footmark, but they couldn't see the person there. Further, footprints followed, one after another, descending the steps and progressing down the street. The boys followed, fascinated, until the muddy impressions became fainter and fainter and at last disappeared altogether. So the boys were actually curious because they couldn't see a person, but they could only see the muddy footprints on the stairs which went towards the streets. The explanation of the mystery was really simple enough. The bewildered boys had been following a scientist who had just discovered how to make the human body transparent. So bewildered means these astonished or these baffled or bemused. So I'm teaching you new vocabularies that you can use in your answers. So these bemused boys were actually following a scientist who had just discovered how to be invisible or how to become transparent. Griffin, the scientist, had carried out experiments after experiments to prove that the human body could become invisible. So, the scientist's name is Griffin. And he had conducted experiments after experiments and finally was able to prove that the human body could indeed become invisible. Finally, he swallowed certain rare drugs and his body became as transparent as a sheet of glass, though it also remained as solid as glass. So here a question could come, how did the scientist manage to become invisible? So the answer will be, the scientist carried out experiments after experiments or conducted. Another word for carried out is conducted. Conducted experiments after experiments and finally, after swallowing a rare drug, His body, though, became transparent, but his body remained solid. So people could feel him but couldn't see him. Brilliant scientist though he was, Griffin was rather a lawless person. So, though he was a brilliant scientist, but he was a lawless person. He did not pay much heed. Pay heed means pay attention to the law. So, he broke the law. Let's see how he broke the law. His landlord disliked him and tried to eject him. So, eject him means get rid of him. In revenge, Griffin set fire to the house. Oh, so this is why he was a lawless person, because when the landlord tried to get rid of him, he set the landlord's house on fire. To get away without being seen, he had to remove his clothes. Thus, it was that he had become a homeless wanderer, without clothes, without money, and quite invisible, until he happened to step in some mud and left footprints as he walked. So, since he did not have a place to live now, he had become a homeless wanderer, and because he did not want to be seen, he had no clothes on and he had no money. So, he was invisible until he stepped on some mud. He escaped easily enough from the boys who followed his footprints in London, but his adventures were by no means over. Okay, so what other adventures did he have? Let's see. He had chosen a bad time of the year to wander about London without clothes. So, why was it a wrong time of the year for him to wander without clothes? If it's a short question, you should know, because it was midwinter. The air was bitterly cold and he could not do without clothes. So it was midwinter and the air was bitterly cold and he couldn't be without clothes. So instead of walking about the streets, he decided to slip into a big London store for warmth. So he went inside a big London store so that he could get some warmth and respite from the bitter cold of the winter. So now I used a word called respite. Respite means relief. Okay, let's move forward. Closing time arrived, and as soon as the doors were shut, Griffin was able to give himself the pleasure of clothing and feeding himself without regard to expense. So, even this shows that he was a lawless person. Why? Because he gave himself clothes. He ate without the regard to expense, because without paying money, he was eating and wearing clothes. He broke open boxes and wrappers and fitted himself out with warm clothes. So he took clothes out of boxes and he started wearing them. Soon, with shoes, an overcoat, and a wide brimmed hat, he became a fully dressed and visible person. So he became visible because he was fully clothed. In the kitchen of the restaurant, he found cold meat and coffee, and he followed up the meal with sweets and wine taken from the grocery store. Okay, so this is why he was a lawless person, because he did not pay for anything that he wore or ate. Finally, he settled down to sleep on a pile of quilts. So finally, he settled down to get some rest. If only Griffin had managed to wake up in good time, all might have been well. So it would have been all right if he got up at the right time. But unfortunately, he did not. As it was, he did not wake up until the assistants were already arriving next morning. So he was sound asleep. Sound asleep means sleeping really well. So he did not get up in time when the store assistants had come. He saw a couple of them approaching. He panicked and began to run. So when he saw them, he naturally panicked and he began to run. But he had forgotten that he was now visible to them as he was fully clothed. They naturally gave chase because it was some person who was illegally staying inside a store post it closing, and he had also not paid for the clothes that he was wearing. In the end, he was able to escape only by quickly taking off his newly found clothes. So, because they could only find him if he had worn clothes, so he removed them. So once more he found himself invisible but naked in the chill January air. This time he decided to try the stock of theatrical company. So these theater companies, they have a lot of costumes that could be worn. So he thought, okay, I will try to go to that place in the hope of finding not only clothes but also something that would hide the empty space above his shoulder. So why did he try to go into a theatrical company? In the hope of finding something that would hide the empty space between his shoulders and the head. So maybe he thought he could find a mask or something because it was a theater company. Shivering with cold, he hurried to Drury Lane, the center of the theater world. So that is where he went, to Drury Lane. He soon found a suitable shop. He made his way, invisible, upstairs and came out a little later wearing bandages around his forehead, dark glasses, false nose, big bushy side whiskers, means maybe a mustache, and a large hat. To escape without being seen, he callously attacked the shopkeeper. Now, what is the meaning of the word callously? Means showing no sympathy or feeling, so hard-heartedly. He just attacked the shopkeeper from behind, after which he robbed him of all the money he could find. So, this also shows that he was a lawless person. Why? Because he, without showing any empathy or sympathy, he attacked the shopkeeper from behind and robbed him of all his money. Eager to get away from crowded London, he took a train to the village of Iping, where he booked 2 rooms at the local inn. So in order to escape the crowded London area, he went to a village called Iping. The arrival of a stranger at an inn in winter was in any case an unusual event. A stranger of such uncommon appearance set all tongues wagging. So, tongues wagging is an idiom, which means people were talking a lot about it or gossiping about him. So, because of his unusual appearance, he had become the talk of the town. Mrs. Hall, the landlord's wife, made every effort to be friendly. But Griffin had no desire to talk and told her, my reason for coming to Iping is a desire for solitude. That means being alone. I do not wish to be disturbed in my work. Besides, an accident has affected my face. Satisfied that her guest was an eccentric scientist. So here there could be a question. Why did Mrs. Hall think that her guest was an eccentric scientist? First of all, the arrival of a stranger during an unusual time of winter was something unusual. Secondly, his uncommon appearance. And he had no desire to talk and asked to be left alone. He, in spite of every effort of Mrs. Griffin to be friendly, made her believe that he was an eccentric scientist. And in view of the fact that he had paid her in advance, Mrs. Hall was prepared to excuse his strange habits and irritable temper. So because he had paid the entire money in advance, She was able to forgive him for his strange habits and irritable temper. But the stolen money did not last long. So if you remember, he had stolen a little of money from the shopkeeper, but it did not last long. And presently, Griffin had to admit that he had no more cash. So he admitted saying, sorry, I do not have any cash, but he pretended that he was expecting a check to arrive at any moment. So he was saying, I'm going to get money, but at the present, I don't have any. Shortly afterwards, a curious episode occurred. Very early in the morning, a clergyman and his wife were awakened by noises in the study. Creeping downstairs, they heard the chink of money being taken from the clergyman's desk. Without making any noise and with the poker grasped firmly in his hand, the clergyman flung open the door and said, surrender. So the clergyman and his wife, they heard a strange noise in his study room and they heard a money being taken from his drawer desk. So with a poker, so a poker is a sharp object like a stick that is used usually in the fireplace to adjust the wood in the fireplace. So he took that sharp object and they wanted to catch the thief red-handed. That is why they did not make any noise and they said surrender. So here you can see that the scientist is taking money from the clergyman's desk, which again shows that he is a lawless person. Then to his amazement is he's amazed, he's astonished. He realized that the room appeared to be empty. So the clergyman, he expected to find someone there, but it was empty. He and his wife looked under the desk and behind the curtains and even up the chimney. So they searched everywhere, but there wasn't a sign of anybody. Yet the desk had been opened and the housekeeping money was missing. Extraordinary affair, the clergyman kept saying for the rest of the day. So he was astonished to see that the money had been taken, but there wasn't anyone there. But it was not as extraordinary as the behavior of Mrs. Hall's furniture a little later that morning. So something weird happened with the furniture a little later in the morning. The landlord and his wife were up very early and were surprised to see the scientist's door wide open. So why were they surprised to see? Because usually it was shut and locked. And he was furious, angry if anyone entered his room. So because he had asked for solitude and he was rude, they usually did not get a glance of his room. The opportunity seemed too good to be missed because they were curious to see what was inside the room that made him so grumpy and so private. They peeped round the door, saw nobody, and decided to investigate. Because they did not find him, they said, let's go ahead and go inside. The bedclothes were cold, showing that the scientist must have been up for some time. And stranger still, the clothes and bandages that he always wore, because he owned only one pair of clothing that he wore. So the clothes that he always wore were lying about in the room. All of a sudden, Mrs. Hall heard a sniff close to her ear. A moment later, the hat on the bedpost leapt up and dashed itself into her face. Then the bedroom chair became alive. Springing into the air, it charged straight at her, legs foremost, as she and her husband turned away in terror. The extraordinary chair pushed them both out of the room and then appeared to slam and lock the door after them. Mrs. Hall almost fell down the stair in hysterics. So hysterics means extreme fear. So actually hysterics could be extreme emotion, but in this case she was extremely fearful and it made her lose control of her emotion because they thought that there was some paranormal activity that was taking place in their inn. She was convinced that the room was haunted by spirits and that the stranger had somehow caused these to enter into her furniture. So again, Here it shows that he was a lawless person because he had nearly attacked them with the chair. My poor mother used to sit in that chair, she moaned. To think it should raise up against me now? The feeling among the neighbors was that the trouble was caused by witchcraft. But witchcraft or not, when news of the burglary at the clergyman's home became known, the strange scientist was strongly suspected of having had a hand in it. So they said the stranger had to have some hand in it because there was money missing. Suspicion grew even stronger when he suddenly produced some ready cash. So, if you remember, he had said that he did not have any cash, but he was expecting a check any moment, and suddenly he said that he had some cash. Though he had admitted not long before that he had no money. So, why did the suspicion grow on the scientist? Because just before he had admitted to have no money and then he produced some money. The village constable was secretly sent for. Instead of waiting for the constable, Mrs. Hall went to the scientist, who had somehow mysteriously appeared from his empty bedroom. I want to know what you have been doing in my chair upstairs, she demanded. And I want to know how it is you came upon an empty room and how you entered a locked room. So she's interrogating the scientist. Interrogating means asking a lot of questions. The scientist was always quick tempered, so we know that he was quick tempered and got angry very fast. Now he became furious, he was really angry. You don't understand who or what I am, he shouted. Very well, I will show you. It's like, you want to see who I am? You don't know who I am. Wait, I will show you. Suddenly he threw off bandages, his whiskers, that is the mustache, the spectacles, and even the false nose. It took him only a minute to do this, and horrified people in the bar found themselves staring at a headless man. So people were horrified, they were petrified because they could not see the face of the person. He was headless. Mr. Jaffers, the constable, so the constable's name is Mr. Jaffers, now arrived and was quite surprised to find that he had to arrest a man without a head. But Jaffers was not easily prevented from doing his duty. So Mr. Jaffers was a diligent police. A diligent means he respected his work. Nothing could prevent him from doing his duty. If a magistrate's warrant ordered a person's arrest, then that person had to be arrested with or without his head. So he's like, if there is a warrant, I am going to do my duty. Even if the person has a head or not, I am going forward with arresting him. There followed a remarkable scene as the policeman tried to get hold of a man who was becoming more and more invisible as he threw off one garment after the other. Finally, a shirt flew in the air, and the constable found himself struggling with someone he could not see because now, after throwing all his clothes, he had become completely invisible. Some people tried to help him but found themselves hit by blows. So he started hitting the people who tried to capture him. In the end, Jaffers was knocked unconscious. Oh, so this person, the scientist, was indeed a lawless man because he had even hit the people and also he had knocked out the police unconscious as he made a last attempt to hold on to the unseen scientist. There were nervous, excited cries of hold him. So everyone wanted to hold him. But this was easier said than done. Griffin had shaken himself free, and now no one knew where to lay hands on him because he was totally invisible. So, this is the story about how a scientist who was supposed to help the people by finding great inventions, had found a unique invention but put the entire society in jeopardy, and how he misused his power in doing lawless things. So that is the end of the story. If you haven't subscribed, do it immediately because I don't want you to miss any important videos that will be uploaded. Study well, God bless you, and I'm praying for you. Take care.